I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused, where we talk about ideas that are outside the mainstream. My guest today is Alex Berezow, who's Vice President of Scientific Affairs with the American Council of Science and Health. Thanks for coming on, Alex.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, I know you're with the ACSH now. I know you from back in the old days when you were with Real Clear Science, and I was doing other things for Real Clear, so I'm trying to sort of I remember fondly some of your pieces from back then and have been following some of what you've been doing since then, so I wanted to get you on. Now, you do, ACSH does debunking of junk science.
Yeah, we were founded in 1978 with the purpose of fixing a lot of the misinformation in the media in regard to science. And we've been around, like I said, for 41 years now. And I think there's actually more junk to debunk now than ever before. So we're still in existence.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to run out of run out of flim flam to take on. All right, so I wanted to talk about a couple things based on some of your recent columns. Some things that are bad science that's been in the news, or misrepresentations of science that have been in the news, and especially in the political news. So one thing that, if for those of us who follow politics, one thing we've seen recently is the little minor controversy over Elizabeth Warren getting her DNA tested to back up the claim that she is, in fact, part Cherokee, and then it coming back and various claims saying, oh, it shows that she's 1,024th part Cherokee. So what's up with the DNA test? How accurate are they really? What do they really tell us about us?
Sure. So, when you're doing a DNA test, it doesn't really make any sense to just have results without a comparison group to look at, what do other Americans have? And unfortunately for Elizabeth Warren, almost all Americans, a random white person from Manhattan or Chicago or San Francisco, and if they have been in the United States for any length of time, almost certainly they're going to have some Native American DNA, maybe a percentage point or two. And the reason for that is that contrary to popular belief, we actually didn't wipe out the Native Americans. We actually married a lot of them. And so there's been a lot of intermixing, and it is extremely common for average Americans to have a little bit of Native American DNA, and there is nothing special about Elizabeth Warren's DNA. She's right in there with every other American.
Yeah, and even the thing about what I remember reading about that is that the marker that they use to say who's Native American, who's not Native American, is not necessarily 100% accurate either, because they use some Mesoamerican group as a proxy. I remember having my DNA tested that it was, it originally came back saying that I was 9% Iberian Peninsula, which, was kind of a surprise and a shock to me. Then they came back and said, oh, we have more accurate results. And that 9% Iberian Peninsula seemed to morph into the Baltics, which is, those are kind of far away. So there's a lot of imprecision in terms of what are the markers for one person versus what are the markers for another.
Yeah, and what they do with Native Americans is that a lot of Native Americans are not interested in these DNA analyses because they're feeling like they're being exploited for various reasons, and so we actually don't have a lot of DNA from actual Native Americans. So because of this, we have to use proxies, people from Peru, from Colombia, from Mexico, and that's the DNA to which Elizabeth Warren's was compared. And as well, you have to look at the fact that when you're looking at a DNA test, it's sort of like looking at a horoscope. The best thing that a genetic test can do is generally show you where your geographical, your biogeographical origin is. So genetic tests are good at saying, okay, we think that you come from the Caucasus regions of Russia, or we think that you're from the Middle East or something. But they're not good at saying, we think that your family is this. Like we don't even have the ability to determine if someone is Cherokee or Apache or Hopi or, all the various tribes that have existed. We have no idea. There's no way to detect any of that. Yeah. And so unless you do the hard work of looking at birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, and building a family tree, genetic test is sort of like a horoscope.
Well, and I think that's a good comparison because it's almost like, and the way that we advertise it, find out who you are. They advertise it oftentimes based on the story that you want to hear about yourself, which is, the story might be comforting, it might be nice, it might be interesting to you, it might be entertaining to you, but in terms of actually telling you who you are, DNA, even if they can get it accurately, it isn't really all that important. It's more the story than the science.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And it's certainly absurd for Elizabeth Warren to claim any Native American culture, which she had been trying to do, based on the fact that somebody, 4 or 5 generations ago was Native American. I mean, she didn't grow up on, in Native American culture, but, the way she talks about her heritage, it makes it sound like she was living in a teepee and smoking peyote, but she wasn't doing any of that stuff, right? And so is really quite shocking how the Cherokee tribe actually came out and said, stop what you're doing. Stop saying things like this because you're not a tribe member. It was pretty shocking how much they condemned Elizabeth Warren.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, going on from that, I want to talk about a couple other issues. You do a range of things, and I'm sort of picking some of the political hot buttons here, some of which are going to be more partisan things that people get upset about. Some of them are going to be things a little more, we can go a little more in depth on. But one of the others is this issue of transgender athletes. Now, I guess this ties in the sense of, this idea of, does your DNA say much about who you are? So we've had a couple stories recently about usually a transgender athlete coming in and usually, walloping women in female sports. And the controversy of, should they be allowed? Now, there's two kinds of stories I've seen in that. One is the male to female transgender athlete, who is a man who has transitioned to become a female, but you look at them and they're tall and they're burly and they're really big people compared to the women they're competing against. The other one I see is the female to male. The girl who's transitioned from female to male, she's still competing in the female category, but she's taking testosterone, which would be, considered doping if you were doing that in another context. So
right.
Let's talk about this issue of does being biologically male or female make a fundamental difference in athletics?
Absolutely. So, for instance, there are all sorts of biological differences between men and women that are not obvious, that are more than skin deep, mm-hmm. right? So the average male has more red blood cells than the average female. Okay. Now you might think, well, who cares? Well, it matters, because if you have more red blood cells, you can carry more oxygen than someone who has fewer red blood cells.
Right. It matters if you're running a marathon.
Exactly right. And so if you're running a marathon, having extra red blood cells will get you maybe closer to that finish line than someone has fewer red blood cells. In fact, it's why blood cell doping is a thing. People will save up their blood cells and they'll package them, and then before a big event, they'll inject themselves with their own blood. Well, it's cheating. And the reason it's cheating is because you're artificially boosting your oxygen supply. Men and women have different builds in terms of their legs. Women are more prone to getting ACL tears simply because their legs are built a little bit differently than a man's because they have wider hips. So, there are a lot of biological differences, structural differences in our skeletons and muscles that make a very large impact at the elite level of sports. There's a reason that Usain Bolt is the fastest man in the world, and he's a full second faster than the fastest woman in the world. And that's not because of the male patriarchy. It's not because of sexism. It's because of biology. Men are simply faster than women.
And one of the claims I've heard used is, well, we can use biomarkers instead. We can measure the testosterone levels and show that the testosterone levels are not artificially high, so therefore she's not really getting an advantage. Now, this is in one of the cases where there was a female wrestler who was undergoing testosterone treatments and transitioning and saying, well, but my testosterone levels aren't too high. But what about the use of the biomarkers? Doesn't change all that other stuff. It doesn't really serve as an adequate proxy for whether it's a fair competition.
So it gets complicated once you get into biomarkers, because the question is which biomarkers are relevant.
Right.
And there are many, many, many different biomarkers you can look at, not just testosterone, but you could be looking at, several other hormones. You could be looking at red blood cell content, muscle mass. I mean, there are so many different things you would have to look at. Here's the bigger question we have to answer. there are some people biologically who are of ambiguous gender, or they have a chromosomal abnormality or a difference that makes them unique. For instance, most people are either born with two X chromosomes, which makes them biologically female, or they're born with an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, which makes them biologically male. But that's not true for everybody. Some people are born with three sex chromosomes. There's a condition known as Klinefelter syndrome, where a man is born with two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, and they have lower testosterone levels. They have gender dysphoria, where they feel like a woman, but they're actually a man. There's another condition called Swyer syndrome, where biological males, so XY, have an abnormality on the Y chromosome where they actually physically develop as females. And a lot of these people will actually not even know it until they hit puberty, that they go, oh, I'm not having menstruation. What's going on? And they go to the doctor and they find out you're actually a male, even though you look like a girl on the outside. And so the question is what do we do with people who have these kinds of conditions? If they want to be athletes, well, they should be able to play sports, but where do you play? Where do you put them? And I think that's a legitimate question, although I agree with you that when you've got, some fairly sizable person who is going through a gender, change, and they're saying, well, I'm a woman now, that presents a challenge, right? Because biologically, they certainly don't look like it. They have the biomarkers for it, and I think that we may want to have some sort of rule in place, because that doesn't seem to be fair. And there was a case of a man who's transitioning to a woman named Rachel McKinnon, right, is a pretty sizable person, and she beat all the biological females in this bicycling race, as you would expect, because right, she's much bigger than all the other ones.
And if you see the photos, I mean, it's an 8-inch height difference and wide shoulders, and yeah.
And so, I don't know the cause of her transgender, what the underlying cause is, and it's not my position to judge it. But if you're looking just from an objective athletic fairness standpoint, you can understand why the women in the race were saying this isn't fair, right? And so, we need to grapple with this topic, and I don't think that our society is grappling with it in a particularly productive way at the moment.
Right. Well, I think that one of the problems is summed up in Rachel McKinnon's reply to this. These complaints are saying that that gender is socially constructed and not biological, and again, it's the idea that here's a story I'm going to tell about what gender is, as opposed to the underlying right, scientific facts about it.
That's a total rejection of biology. Anyone who says that gender is a social construct, to an extent, we place some social baggage on gender. But no, it is largely biologically determined, and to reject that, to not acknowledge that, is basically rejecting biology textbooks. Right, I mean, this is it's a ridiculous position to hold.
Well, I think it's sensible to say there are cultural associations we have with gender that are subject to social conventions and habits and customs. But it's built on top of the underlying real, measurable, scientifically verifiable biological difference.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, I think the most substantive issue I want to bring up today, and it's one where science impinges on a major issue of public policy, because a lot of this, transgender stuff, it affects the people who are in the sports. It's something that people like to fight about on Twitter and have the sort of culture war arguments about.
Right.
But this is one that's, I think, a bigger issue, more of a life and death issue, which is the opioid crisis.
Sure.
And there's a lot of narratives being put out about it in politics that I want to get an idea of what actually is the underlying, scientifically, in terms of the numbers, in terms of the actual causes of what's happening here, to get an idea of what science has to contribute to that debate. Sure. And first of all, let's start. What is an opioid?
So opioids are drugs that are derived from opium, or they're similar to drugs that are derived from opium. So think of like morphine. Heroin is an opioid. And these drugs are nervous system depressants, which is why if you overdose on them, what happens is that you slowly stop breathing, and you basically go to sleep and you don't wake up. And that's how people overdose. The number of people who are dying from opioid overdoses is just staggering. It's 72,000 Americans died from drug overdoses overall, with opioids being the leading cause. And that was in 2017.
And that's several multiples of the people who die in car accidents these days.
Oh, yeah, it's
because we've done so much to make cars safer that those numbers have gone down.
Yeah,
and then this is soaring beyond it.
Yeah, it's double the number of car crash fatalities and quadruple the number of homicides. I mean, it's a staggering number. The dominant media narrative is that it's big pharma. They're to blame for this, and it is so overly simplistic that I would say it's bordering a lie. So here's what happened. First of all, we have to recognize that there's been drug crises in this country for decades, right? Back in the 80s and 90s, there was a crack epidemic. Right. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a methamphetamine epidemic. You can't blame Big Pharma for that because they don't prescribe methamphetamines to people. You don't go to your doctor and he's like, hey, why don't you go to the corner and get some crack, right? So no, you can't blame Big Pharma for that. So the role they did play, though, was that in the mid-90s, a drug called OxyContin came out, and it was an opioid that was said by its manufacturer, Purdue, that it was not as addictive as other opioids, and it ended up not being true. And as the number of prescriptions for OxyContin and other opioids increased, people were becoming hooked to it. Unfortunately, the market got flooded with a lot of these drugs, and the reason is because doctors were kind of lackadaisical in their prescribing. They would, you'd say, "Oh, I've got some pain," and they would say, maybe you needed it for a week. You had some surgery, dental surgery, and instead of giving you a week of opioid prescription, they give you a month. Okay. So a lot of these drugs ended up falling into the wrong hands. They fell into the hands of drug users, abusers, teenagers, people who shouldn't have had them. Right. Well, once that happened, fined for basically lying about their drug, and they then decided to release an abuse-resistant form of OxyContin. So what drug abusers would do is they would take OxyContin, they would smash it, and then you would take that and smash it, you'd melt it or whatever, and inject it into your veins.
So you get a faster high. The time release, you'd overcome the time release, and you get the fast high.
That's right. So what Purdue did was they decided, well, we're not going to make OxyContin crushable anymore. Now, if you try to crush it, it'll turn into this gooey mess, and it's totally unusable. So it was called abuse-proof OxyContin. Well, the problem with that is that once you're hooked, you still want your fix. So people started turning to heroin instead. And the problem with heroin is that it's dangerous. Your local drug dealer probably shouldn't be trusted. I know. What kind of country have we gotten into when you can't trust your local drug dealer? I get it. But
no, this is a guy who probably failed high school chemistry, and you're now relying on him for a pharmacological product you're going to put into your body.
Yeah, this isn't Breaking Bad stuff. You're not getting the good stuff, right? So what we're finding now is that heroin is being contaminated on purpose with a drug called fentanyl. And fentanyl is an extremely potent drug. It's about 50 times more potent than morphine. And 3 milligrams is enough to overdose. And 3 milligrams, if you take a salt shaker and shake out a couple of little crystals of salt, that's 3 milligrams. So if the drug isn't cut properly, you can easily overdose. And what we're finding now is that even though opioid prescriptions from doctors is way down, the number of opioid deaths is way up. And really, the number of overdose deaths from Vicodin and OxyContin and these prescription drugs has remained unchanged in the past 7 or 8 years, while fentanyl and heroin deaths have skyrocketed. And so it is an illegal drug problem among recreational users. That is by far the number one cause of this crisis. It is not big pharma.
Now, the other question I had about that, the other big media narrative more on the right, is that these are the quote unquote deaths of despair. That is, these are people who they're hopeless in life and they have nothing to live for, so they become addicted to drugs and they overdose. And it's sort of like a way of saying this is, blame it all on China because, we had free trade with China and they lost their factory jobs and that's why they're dying. This is sort of the Tucker Carlson narrative recently. And, this may get into more like the causes of, well, why do people become drug addicts? But I also noticed in a lot of these cases, if you look at the personal histories involved, these people were not in despair before they became addicted. They became, they had the crash of their prospects came after the addiction.
Yeah, addiction is complicated, and we always are looking for scapegoats. We want to blame somebody for our problems, and we know that the opioid crisis has hit rural America particularly hard. So does economic misfortune play a role in this? I'm sure it does. I mean, a lot of people are driven to drinking because of economic misfortune. But as I said before, we have had drug crises forever in this country. We've had a heroin epidemic before, back in the 80s as well. Yeah. And so you cannot just point to China and say it's their fault. We have struggled as Americans with addiction in this country for decades. And so I don't think it's convenient or correct it may be convenient, but it's not correct to blame China or some other country for our problems.
The other suggestive thing to me is that, they talk about this happens in rural America, but when you map out the overdose deaths, they tend to follow the highways. They tend to follow, Route 40 going across Ohio or that sort of thing. Because that's where the illegal drugs are moving. So you get some, dealer comes up with a new dose of fentanyl-laced heroin or fentanyl, something with fentanyl in it, and sends out a shipment, and it goes up the highway, and then people get it. People who live near the highway, they're the ones who get it first. They get the most of it. That's where you see the overdose deaths. So in a way, I mean, I think one of the suggestive things here is the extent to which drug prohibition is a contributor to this, because instead of being able to get treatment or instead of being able to get a safer version of the drug, these people are getting the least safe version of the drug.
Right. So, and this is a huge topic here in Seattle. We're actually thinking, we've been debating this for a while, of having safe injection sites where people can go and inject drugs safely. They're going to these safe injection sites, and they're not using contaminated needles, and they're getting the drugs they need. But if you're not helping them get off the drug, then what use? You're essentially just enabling them. And so this is actually a really complicated topic, and I'm not sure what the correct solution to this problem is, because the nature of addiction is so complicated. It's a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, I understand that, and I think the point you've made that oftentimes because people don't know how to look at statistics, they don't know how to look at the history of things. They see, a bunch of people are dying from this one drug. This is an unprecedented phenomenon, and they don't realize that it may just be a change in fashion, as it were. From the drug that was popular 10 years ago has switched over to a new drug that's popular now, that's become, for one reason or other, easier to get, and so you're not seeing necessarily a fundamental change in society. You're seeing a change from one thing to another that looks magnified beyond what it really is.
Yes, and I also think that you'd mentioned earlier about treating this as a public health issue. I think that's exactly the way to go. I don't think that declaring war on drugs, has worked very well. And so I would like to see us treat it as a public health issue. In Portugal, I believe it was Portugal, that legalized all drugs. Now, is that the right solution? I don't know. But from what I understand, Portugal has gotten its drug problem under control by treating it as a public health issue. And so I think that we should head in that direction and treat this as these people need our help, and we should be helping them rather than punishing them.
Right, exactly. Treat it more as a public health or as a health crisis than as a law enforcement issue, or even as a border security issue, which is
correct.
I'm not going to get into this. This is more of a law enforcement thing. But the other aspect of this is that most of the fentanyl coming in is being smuggled through ports of entry. It's not coming across the border, right?
Correct. So a wall won't fix this problem.
Because with fentanyl in particular, it's so powerful. You need this very tiny amount. So it's easy to ship by FedEx from China, from a lab and an unethical lab in China, ship that by FedEx to the U.S., get it through border. It's a lot easier to do that than smuggling 40 kilos of cocaine on the back of an illegal immigrant crossing the Rio Grande, which I guess is the image people have in their minds.
Yeah, that's the image people have, but it's not accurate. You are absolutely correct that most of the illegal drugs are coming in through legal ports of entry. That's right.
All right. So the issue I want to end on for today's discussion, and I'd love to have you back in the future to talk about some other things, science issues as they come up in the news. But the issue I want to end on is that, you know, as I've started podcasting, I've realized if I really want to make it in the radio business, I should be selling nutritional supplements. Yeah, I found out a while back though. This is you know, Alex Jones, the crazy conspiracy theory guy. You think he's a millionaire because he sells conspiracy theories? No, he's a millionaire because he sells bogus nutritional supplements. So that leads me to the overall question of nutrition and the science of nutrition and the various ways in which that is used and misused. One thing you suggested at one point, and you didn't quite put it this way, but that nutrition is in a way a victim of its own success. That, you know, having identified a lot of the big important nutritional facts, like, you know, the different vitamins and things like that, they're now have gone down to dealing with the small stuff.
Yeah, that's right. So we have solved all the major problems in nutrition. We don't get scurvy anymore because we know to get, you know, drink vitamin C. We don't get all sorts of other diseases, beriberi, that were the result of various vitamin deficiencies. We know that babies need certain nutrients at certain times, and so we give it to them. And so now we're obsessed with linking food to cancer and to Alzheimer's disease and to all sorts of things, that because we've really solved all the big problems, and now we're always looking to be scared of something.
Right.
And we're also always looking for quick fixes to tough problems. You know, obesity. Obesity is a problem, but the answer to obesity is not to eat more blueberries. It's not a superfood. It's to exercise and eat less. And that's not something Americans want to hear, because it requires discipline and accountability. And who likes discipline and accountability, right?
Well, yeah, a number of years ago, I lost some weight. I put a little bit back on when I had kids, but I lost a fair bit of weight. And a friend of mine said, "Well, how did you do it? Tell me your secret." And he says, and I said, "Well, I just exercised and I ate less." And he said, "Isn't there a pill or something? Can't you please tell me there's a pill?" You know, it's what people want to know. I also think, you know, they want to have. I think the big thing people, because I've been observing the weight loss stuff for a long time, I think the big thing people want to be told is, you can eat anything you want so long as it's this one thing, or it's, you know, as long as it's superfoods, or right. You know, they want to be told you don't have to have the discipline of actually controlling how much you eat and your portions or what have you. You can do whatever you like so long as you follow this one weird trick that will solve it for you.
Yeah, and you know, if you look back at American history, we have a long history of this. You know, Mr. Haney from Green Acres, right? He had potions in the back of his truck that he wanted to sell people, and we go back, you know, a century or more on literally snake oil salesmen going around selling things that were magical cures. Americans are very optimistic, and I think that optimism sometimes turns into gullibility, where we think that there are quick fixes to complicated problems. All I need is a pill or this one exercise regimen, and I'm going to live forever. And the reality is a lot more boring than that. The reality is that, you know, you've got to diet, you've got to exercise, you got to watch what you eat, you've got to be, you know, you don't have to be a Puritan and not ever having a piece of cake, but you can't have 3 pieces of cake, right? You only have a little bit of cake.
Well, by the way, the flip side of this is something I heard, a brilliant identification, a psychiatrist who identified what he called orthorexia. And it's an eating disorder that involves an obsession with eating right. And the idea is, you know, it's the people who say, well, you know, eating healthy always consists to them of eliminating something from your diet. Oh, I can't eat dairy, and I can't eat gluten, and I can't eat this, and I can't eat that.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I eat whatever I want, but I also realize that I can't eat as much as I want, right? And so I have cake. I like dessert. In fact, I usually have a piece of something every day, but I don't eat the whole thing. I'll have a few bites, put the rest in the refrigerator, and I'll say, well, I'll have some more tomorrow. You know, it's just discipline. And it also involves a little bit of luck too. You know, my family's all thin, so genetically we're probably we probably burn more energy than other people or something. I don't know, but it requires discipline and a little bit of good luck. But there are no magic solutions. There are no pills you need to buy. Just be disciplined.
Now, the other thing I've observed in nutrition is the way they kind of, I think, rely on people's lack of training with the use of statistics. So,
sure.
And this comes across a lot of times where you have studying the effect of eating broccoli, right? And it's this tiny little effect. And if you actually understand the way to look at the numbers, the effect they're measuring statistically in terms of the outcome of two different, their test group versus the control group, it's a very, very, very small effect, and really isn't that meaningful. But some of the ways they express it, you're 50% more likely to get cancer.
Yes.
50% difference on a tiny, tiny little number.
Yes. This is the difference between absolute risk and relative risk. Mm-hmm. And this comes through clear as a bell on cancer studies. People will say, well, if you do this one thing, if you go to, Beijing one time, your risk of this cancer has been doubled. Well, and it's, from 1 in a million to 2 in a million or something, right? It's something absurdly small. And so, that they do that on purpose. They will play up these percentages to make it look like a much bigger impact than it actually is. And that's because people don't understand relative risk versus absolute risk. I completely agree with you.
And using those projections, I think it may have been one of your articles I saw that there was somebody who did a survey of studies and calculated that by eating a certain group of foods, he could extend his lifespan by 150 years. I don't know if that was one of your articles or somewhere else that I saw that, but that's
it's
because you keep seeing these things. You
really
eat this
absurd conclusions. Yeah, if you believe everything you read in nutrition in the media, you come up with these absolutely absurd conclusions. And so, the real solution is moderation in everything and discipline.
And I think also recognizing, now this goes to another issue that I think we should discuss in more length another time, but this issue of the world that we live in is actually pretty amazing. There's been huge amounts of progress made, but people are still motivated by the scare stories and the negatives, and this thing's going to give you cancer and that thing's going to give you cancer, when in fact we eat in America, and in the Western world, the developed world, we eat a really good, healthy diet on the whole, and our body is not besieged by toxins in every corner.
That's right. Life has been getting better steadily since the dawn of man. We're living longer, we're living healthier, and it's a real shame because people are always looking for something to be afraid of or scared of when we are living in probably the most prosperous, safest time to have ever been alive. Steven Pinker talks a lot about this. This is one of his key themes in Enlightenment Now and the Better Angels of Our Nature, that we are actually living in a golden age, and we should stop worrying so much and be thankful that we're living in 2019.
Agreed. Well, I'm thankful that you came on to the show, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this conversation, you'll find more ideas and analysis at the Tracinski Letter, TracinskiLetter.com. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast, and you can support us at Patreon, patreon.com/Salon of the Refused. I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused. Thank you for listening.